Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our 2026 Community Grants Technical Assistance for PCEF's Regenerative Agriculture and Green Infrastructure Funding Area. My name is Brianna Brawley. I use she and they pronouns, and I work with the Portland Clean Energy Fund as a Regenerative Agriculture Project Manager. Katya, want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Katya Reyna. I use she, her pronouns, and I am also a regenerative agriculture, green infrastructure project manager at the Portland Clean Energy Fund. And yeah, we're excited to chat with you today.
Okay. Great. So the Portland Clean Energy Fund has various funding areas. For today, we'll be focusing on the green infrastructure and regenerative agriculture funding areas. So you can see a full list here on the screen of our funding areas, but for today, we'll just be focusing on application support, tips and tricks for these two funding areas. Okay, so regenerative agriculture. The regenerative agriculture funding area for PCEF focuses on improving access to local food, fibers, and materials for community members. And there's a real focus here in this funding area on regenerative growing practices that help to sequester carbon in the soil and build a healthier urban environment.
And the other section is the green infrastructure. These projects are mostly focused on plants and establishing and maintaining trees and plants, mostly native shrubs and ground cover. Also habitat restoration, depaving, as in removing asphalt to create more green spaces. And these projects, one of the ways that we measure success for these projects is greenhouse gas emission reduction.
Thank you. Okay, so this is a look at our team. This is Mika, who is not with us today, but will be supporting any applicants that are funded through this next round of community grants. There's Katya in the middle, and then my Brianna on the end. Great, so we'll take a look here at the 2025 Community Grants RAGI. RAGI is Regenerative Agriculture and Green Infrastructure portfolio. So last year we awarded 15 RAGI projects. Of those, we had 10 regenerative agriculture grants and 5 green infrastructure grants. So for our regenerative agriculture grants, we had 6 large grants, 2 small grants, 1 planning grant, and 1 general operating grant. We'll get into the details of this in the next few slides so that you understand the difference between that large, small, planning, and general operating. But for our green infrastructure grants, we had 5 total. Of those 5, we had 3 large grants, 2 small grants, and 0 planning grants. And general operating grants apply to only the regenerative agriculture funding area for PCEF. And so you'll notice that we don't have those for the other funding areas. And this image to the right of the screen is basically a bar graph of the recommended allocations by funding area. So these are the total picture of funding for the 2025 cycle that was approved. Great. Katya, can you go into the different grant types?
Yes. Okay, so we have, as Brianna mentioned, we have green infrastructure grants as well as regenerative agriculture grants. In the green infrastructure side on the left, you can see we have planning grants. These are 1 to 2 year grants that really support sort of laying down the foundation for future implementation grants. And we have that available for green infrastructure and for regenerative agriculture. And then we also have green infrastructure and regenerative agriculture implementation grants available in small and large quantities. And we'll get into that a little bit in the next slides, but essentially we do this to make sure that there is an even or there's an array of different size projects so that all the money doesn't just go to large projects or smallish projects. We like to have a diversity. And yeah, I'll let you speak a little bit about the Gen Ops since that's that's for Gen Ag only.
Yeah, so for our regenerative agriculture funding area, we have a special third thing, which is general operating funding. And so this is funding, and we'll get into the specifics soon, but to give a preview, this funding is available for organizations whose primary focus is regenerative agriculture work. And so this kind of narrows the availability of funding. Again, an org has to be primarily focused on regenerative agriculture work to be eligible for general operating funding. We'll keep moving. Our 2026 funding cap. So as you prepare your application, it's important to pay close attention to the funding caps. And this basically helps us ensure the mix of projects within each portfolio, which also helps balance staffers' grant portfolios as project managers. The application process is identical for the large and small grants, but the difference there is the size of the budget for the grant. So you'll see to the right, we have images here that discuss the caps for regenerative agriculture and green infrastructure grants. For regenerative agriculture funding area, the total amount of funding for the 2026 cycle is expected to be $5.3 million total. And within that, the large grant cap is $1 million. The small grant cap is $200,000. And so as you prepare your budget, be sure to pay attention to those grant caps. If we see that you're requesting over that, especially over that $1 million grant cap, we will have to follow up and ask for some level of reduction in your project. So just pay close attention to that as you build out your project. And then, of course, we have the general operating grants. And so that is capped at 25% of the organization's annual operating budget or $200,000 per year, whichever is lower. And so if your organization's annual operating budget is over $800,000, then you'd be capped at that $200,000 per year cap. For green infrastructure this round, we have around $1.7 million expected to be available for funding. And then again, those large and small grant caps are the same. Large grant cap will be at $1 million per proposal, and the small grant cap will be at $200,000. We also discussed planning grants. And so for planning grants across all of the funding areas, so even beyond just regenerative agriculture and green infrastructure, we expect to have about $2 million available to support planning projects. And we have two types of planning projects. So there is community engagement, research, and curriculum development, where we have a $100,000 cap. And then if you're doing something that involves technical assessments or feasibility studies, we have a bit more funding available for those projects at $200,000 per project. So as you're building out your budget, just pay close attention to those grant caps. It reduces follow-ups during the review process. And one important thing here is that we really expect to see organizations request an amount that makes sense to deliver the project and to deliver a project that has clear climate benefits. So whether that's carbon sequestration or greenhouse gas emissions reductions, but climate benefit that is balanced with community benefits. So we want to see how do PCEF priority populations benefit from these projects that we're funding and that get awarded. And we want to see all of that with seeing a balance between the capacity of the organization and the overall funding request. So it's really important to consider how much funding you think your organization can effectively manage. Okay, we'll keep moving. So
I can talk about these if you want, Brianna.
That's great.
Yeah. So as we mentioned earlier, we'll talk a little more about these different types of grants. So as we mentioned, we do have planning grants available. These are only 1 to 2 year grants, and they really are meant to support anything from conducting assessments to any other preparatory activities that need to develop a full project proposal. So these grants are intended to work to help with the work that lays the foundation for future implementation. It is common that someone will complete a planning grant to take the steps to then apply for an implementation grant. We cannot guarantee that you will be funded for the implementation grant if you completed the planning grant, but it does tend to set organizations up in a great way. So we definitely recommend those, especially for emerging orgs or organizations that are starting to take a new direction or having a pivot shift. Sometimes it's just helpful to have that planning time before you apply for the implementation grant. And then our implementation grants, those can last anywhere from 1 to 5 years. These projects are the ones that address the climate change directly, advance social, economic, and climate justice. This can include physical improvements and or non-physical activities, staff time, contracted work, purchase of equipment, materials, and supplies, anything associated with fulfilling program requirements. There can be some planning as part of the implementation, but really the implementation needs to be the primary focus of the application. And within these implementation grants, we as grant managers would work with you to create a set of milestones, and you'll be expected to complete those milestones and really show that something is completed within those 1 to 5 years. And the Regenerative Agriculture General Operating Fund, I'll let Brianna talk more about that, but essentially that's only a 1 to 3 year fund, and it's only available for regenerative agriculture practices. So I'll let you talk about that.
Yeah, and we'll get into a slide that goes more into our general operating funding. But again, the big focus here is that the primary focus of the organization is local food production using regenerative agricultural practices. And so this is for organizations that have a track record doing this work in this space. This is not for emerging regenerative agriculture projects that are a component of an organization's overall work. This is really focused on a regenerative agriculture nonprofit. So that is a key eligibility criteria for that type of funding. Another thing here with the different types of applications. So as you think about what you want to apply for this round of community grants, you should keep in mind that an organization can submit up to 2 grant applications as the primary applicant. If an organization is on more than one application, or if an organization is submitting more than one application, the second application either needs to fall under a different primary funding category. So the funding categories are regenerative agriculture, green infrastructure. We have workforce and contractor development. So those funding areas we went over in one of the early slides. Or it needs to be a different type of grant application. So you cannot submit 2 regenerative agriculture green infrastructure implementation grants we would need to see like one planning grant, one implementation grant, maybe one implementation grant, one general operating grant. But we cannot see two grant applications for the same type of grant in the same funding category. So that's something to keep in mind as you decide what to apply for. Okay, general operating support pilot. So this is a pilot program that the Portland Clean Energy Fund is running. And this funding is available, again, for organizations whose primary focus is local food production using regenerative agricultural practices. The amount covered is capped at 25% of operating costs or $200,000 annually, whichever is less. So again, if your organization has an annual operating budget of $800,000 or more, you'd be capped at that $200,000 per year. And in that case, you'd be eligible for up to $600,000 for a 3-year general operating grant term. This support applies only to organizations that pay their entire staff wages at or above the PCEF minimum wage. And so that's something we'll get into, but part of the Portland Clean Energy Fund requirements is that staff whose time you are expensing or invoicing to PCEF must be paid at or above the PCEF minimum wage, and the PCEF minimum wage is 180% above the relevant local minimum wage. And so right now, that is $29.34 an hour. Is that correct, Katya?
Yes, that is correct. And it usually shifts when the new fiscal year happens. So usually around July 1st is when we'll receive a new rate.
Great, thank you. And so that is something to think about if you are going for general operating funding, is that we'd expect to see every staff member at the organization making at or above the PCEF minimum wage. And this is a little bit different from our implementation grants, where staff working on the project need to be making at or above the PCEF minimum wage requirement. Because general operating funding applies across the organization as a whole, and we're supporting the work of the organization as a whole, all staff members need to be paid at or above that wage requirement. That's something to keep in mind and to build into your application, especially those annual increases. Another thing here, if you are a current general operating grantee, you will not be eligible to apply for additional general operating support until your current grant expires. And then, as we discussed on the last slide, we have a 2-application limit. And so if you decide to go for a general operating grant and you apply there, that counts as one of your applications, one of your 2 applications. You are eligible to apply for a regenerative agriculture general operating support grant and a regenerative agriculture implementation grant if they're submitted as separate applications. And so then in that case, that would be your 2 applications. Okay, we'll get into eligible projects. Katya, can you take this?
Yes. Okay, so when we talk about eligibility, within the regenerative agriculture green infrastructure project sector, we do include projects that might include things like gardening, food production, and food sovereignty. Specifically under regenerative agriculture, these projects can and should improve access to local food, fibers, and materials, but also through the use of practices that sequester carbon in the soil and support a healthier urban environment. That sequestering carbon in the soil is key. Work really needs to demonstrate that there is something happening in the soil. So things that are in containers or things that are just distributing, pre-made food will likely not qualify for this funding, and we'll speak to that more later, but just remembering that the key is carbon sequestration in the soil is how we're measuring eligibility for regenerative agriculture projects. And for green infrastructure projects, these can include planting, establishment, and maintenance of trees, restoration, depaving, planting, and establishing native plants and shrubs. And with all green infrastructure projects, these must reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that is something that we at PCEF, we have staff that can help calculate that. You won't be expected to calculate the GHG reductions of your project. What we will have you do is submit like a questionnaire, and with that information that we collect, then we can calculate what the GHG reduction is, the greenhouse gas emission reduction is. So just want to note that's not something that grantees are expected to calculate themselves, but it is something that grantees should keep in mind as they're applying. Some of these projects may include production distribution, so growing fresh food to be donated to local community organizations, using gardening to bring people together, any cultural celebrations, and teaching about food growing practices, as well as food sovereignty. And so this includes supporting traditional or culturally specific methods of growing food, but also fiber and medicine. And so we just want to emphasize that as well, that all does qualify. And it's it's not always thought of. And so we just want to make sure that folks know that we also think of more of these more culturally specific projects.
Great, thanks, Katya. The one thing I'll add for the regenerative agriculture eligible projects is we are expecting to see, again, those regenerative growing practices. The soil carbon sequestration is key to eligibility for projects in that funding area. And there are a variety of methods that you can use. When you submit your application, there will be a questionnaire similar to what Katya mentioned for green infrastructure. But for regenerative agriculture, we ask you to let us know what practices you're utilizing so that we can get a better picture of what the regenerative practices are. And you can always feel free to include that as well in your narrative. You don't just have to share it on that form, but there are a variety of growing methods or types of growing that are eligible here. You can grow in the ground, raised beds are eligible, containers are eligible. The key here is that there is some level of carbon sequestration work happening. So if we can tie it to work happening in the soil, that supports eligibility here. Okay. So regenerative agriculture, we've gone through some of this already, but basically the focus of this space, community, production and distribution, and food sovereignty. Something I'll add here is that the food distribution and food recovery is an emerging space within the regenerative agriculture funding area. And the key thing to keep in mind here is that food distribution is eligible. Again, we need to focus on the soil carbon sequestration. And so if an organization is growing the food to be donated locally, that supports eligibility. If an organization would like to source from farmers within the city of Portland, that is eligible. But PCEF cannot support and cannot support, or this is ineligible if there is sourcing from farms that are outside of the city of Portland limits. So keep that in mind as you're identifying partners and building your application, that we're really focused on physical improvements and land tending work that is happening within the city of Portland limits. Katya, would you like to do this one?
Yes. So with green infrastructure, really the focus is on these projects are environmental services, habitat, and placemaking. When we say environmental services, we are referring to things like shade, which can be created with trees, but also with potentially covered structures. Um, Things that support temperature regulation, so reducing heat island effect and creating cooling areas, especially as our summers get hotter. Stormwater capture, soil restoration, and in general improved ecological function. You can see on the right here, there's a photograph of a project that was completed by DPAVE. This was a PCEF funded project, and just want to point out that there are permeable pavers there on the ground. So that is considered a green infrastructure element that does qualify for PCEF funding, just as an example, because it is allowing for water to go through and reducing stormwater runoff, etc. So just keeping in mind that there are different forms of green infrastructure elements. Habitat, so this can be restoring open space to foster habitat for birds, but also native bees and pollinators, and just in general strengthening the food web. So one of the easiest ways to do that is to plant more native plants. So all of that qualifies for this funding. And then the last thing we talk about is placemaking. We really emphasize the importance of projects that are for people to use, engage with, and gather around and learn from, and really have a connection to land and connection to the environment. So PCEF loves to see projects that are really for the community and will be used by PCEF priority populations even after the grant is over. So anything that really demonstrates that longevity and that commitment to ongoing stewardship is it's always something that we like to see.
Great, thank you. Okay, ineligible RAGI projects.
Yeah,
So
I can. Sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
I was just going to talk about the tree planting. Yeah, so the tree planting on public property is eligible, but it does require letters of support from the relevant land management agency. So this could be Portland Bureau of Transportation, Bureau of Environmental Services, or Portland Parks. So that is tree planting on public property. However, street tree planting, which is the public right-of-way, is not eligible and cannot be included as a part of the green infrastructure project scope. And that is because Portland Clean Energy Fund already funds street tree planting through one of our strategic programs. So we can't also fund that through a community grant. So just want to really make that distinction that public property can be eligible with a letter, but street tree planting is entirely out of scope for us.
Thanks, Katya. And then ineligible regenerative agriculture project elements. So land acquisition is not eligible. If there is an interest in acquiring land, we cannot support that through a community grant. So there's also an element where we are not prioritizing land that is leased versus land that is owned. And so as you build out your project, it's fine, whatever type of land access you have, just make that clear to us, and just know that we cannot fund land acquisition through community grants. We also cannot fund hydroponics or aquaponics implementation projects. Again, that is because of the soil carbon sequestration element of PCEF's regenerative agriculture funding area. We cannot support produce purchased from farms outside of Portland and outside of the City of Portland limits at all, including Sauvie or Wapato Island. And also, we do not fund indoor agriculture projects that would increase energy use without reducing greenhouse gas emissions. These are some pictures of different grantees and their work. Believe we have Portland Fruit Tree Project, DeRose Community Bridge and Holistic Wellness. We've got DPAVE, and we've got Friends of Tryon Creek. So just some current and past grantees and some examples of different projects. So we have an Orchard Care Day here on the left with Portland Fruit Tree Project. We have a regenerative agriculture education program for community participants. We have a depaving green infrastructure project through DPAVE, and then we have some tree planting through Friends of Tryon Creek, which would be a green infrastructure project. Okay. I think we'll pause a little bit on this slide just so you have a moment to look at some sample awarded project summaries from the past. You'll see the project summary, and then in blue, we've kind of highlighted some of the key activities that make these different projects eligible to the relevant funding area. So on the left, you'll see a regenerative agriculture project summary with those key project elements highlighted, and then the same on the right for green infrastructure. Is there anything you'd like to point out here, Katya?
I think I'll just read some of the key points. Just some of the things that stand out to these projects that really qualify for specifically regenerative agriculture green infrastructure funding are the collecting and processing of waste materials before returning them to farms to improve soil health and crop production, expanding access to local food, rerouting surplus food from farmers markets to East Portland pantries, soil health assessments, increasing community access to locally produced foods and strengthening both community and soil resiliency, depaving, as in removing asphalt, 1,000 square feet of asphalt from a parking lot, planting native and pollinator-friendly plants, implementing rainwater catchment systems and installing greenhouse and improving existing garden infrastructure, and strengthening community connections.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so these are some of the key elements that we've pulled from past projects when we're determining what are the overall goals of the project and how does that tie to what is eligible within the funding areas. Okay, so we'll get into some application resources and tips. I think the biggest thing is that we are looking for a balance of climate and community benefit. The Portland Clean Energy Fund, or PCEF, really stands for the Portland Clean Energy Community Benefits Fund. And PCEF's role is to provide a funding source for community climate work that supports social, economic, and environmental benefits for all Portlanders, particularly PCEF priority populations. You can find a clear definition of PCEF priority populations in the applicant handbook, which we'll get into soon. But essentially, we're looking for projects that balance the climate aspect with the community aspect. Ideally, there are longstanding or emerging relationships with community members where community members have input in the types of programs that would support them. And we want the climate benefits to not only be like tree planting, but we'd like for community members to directly benefit from the climate elements of a project. Okay, key components of a PCEF application. Katya, can you take this?
Yes. So when you are preparing your PCEF application, there are definitely some key things you want to make sure you have. The first is being aware of the PCEF wage rate. So as we mentioned a little bit earlier, by law, payments for work, and that includes personnel, so staff hired by your organization, but also contractors and subcontractors. Anyone that is paid through the Portland Clean Energy Fund must be at least 180% of the relevant state minimum wage. And as we mentioned, this is expected to have an annual increase on July 1st each year. So just making sure that you build this expense into your project budget and anticipate an increase each year. Physical improvements, so anything related to an actual physical installation, gardening, farming, land tending, all those activities must happen within the city of Portland limits. There are very few exceptions for this. We are very much a fund that is directed towards the Portland city limits. When thinking about personnel versus contracts, you can really consider your organization's staffing structure and budget accordingly. So for example, contracted staff would be, hiring folks to come in and do construction work, for example, or design work. Those might not be things that you can complete in-house, so you might hire a contractor to do that, versus you might budget out more for your employees. And this would be a personnel budget. So just really thinking about how much of the budget you want to allocate towards contractors versus personnel, and really making sure that it aligns with the work you are describing in the application, and that it aligns with, what exactly you're trying to accomplish within this project specifically. Overhead. So overhead is auto-calculated now, so it's not something that you necessarily need to do the math for, but it does take into account that there are indirect and administration costs each year. This could include rent, utilities, admin, insurance, websites. And the way we calculate this line item is by taking 10% of your budget for travel, material, contract costs, and other costs, plus 20% of your personnel budget. And okay, I think that's all for that. And then thinking about a clear project narrative and milestones, specificity and detail really do help the review committees determine not only project feasibility and scale, but also just whether it'll be a success. And the more information that we have, the easier it is to understand the project and not require follow-up questions. Multifaceted projects tend to have different categories of milestones, so there can be engagement, planting, events, food distribution, and it's really good to include all of that. And we do encourage quantifying things when possible in your milestones. So instead of just saying, we're going to host 353, we're going to host community volunteers and volunteer events, if you can specifically say, we'll host about 350 community volunteers at 50 volunteer events to install about, 2,000 native plants. All of that is really helpful in understanding the scale of your project and the impact. Cost savings. So if applicable, detail expected reductions in expenses, estimated savings per person or household, and how these figures were calculated. So consider organizational cost savings versus cost savings for PCEF priority populations. Some of these examples can include reduced energy load, utilities for office buildings due to shading from planting, community member food cost savings due to a produce delivery program. And some of these are not as obvious. And so we really encourage folks to think about ways that their project will be producing cost savings for the priority populations and for the people that the project is serving.
Great, thanks, Katya. Okay, so building a realistic budget. There are a few things here. One of them, as we mentioned before, is ensuring that your team has the capacity to manage the funds effectively. Request only what's needed for community impact, so that clear climate and community benefit. Another thing is that realistically, with the review process, funding will not be flowing until 2027. So you should account for any wage increases that your org has planned. Think about inflation as you build your budget. Again, there's that PCEF wage requirement with an annual increase on July 1st of each year. PCEF also has insurance requirements. At times, those can be higher than what most nonprofit insurance requirements, or much higher than what most of our nonprofit partners have as their insurance prior to getting a PCEF grant. So the city of Portland has higher insurance requirements. So you might bring that into the budget. And then think about permitting fees, unexpected costs, and then think about the contractors early. You might work to get some quotes to build into your application budget. Let's see. There's a car going off. Can you hear that? Okay.
Only a little bit. Yeah.
Okay. We'll just keep rolling. So building a realistic budget. It's great to build a flexible estimate that you can rework as you refine the project and the application. The more detail that you provide, the better that the review committee is able to determine the essential expenses, which can reduce some follow-up during the review process. So these are the key budget categories: personnel, materials, travel, contracts. There's an other category. If you don't know where it should go, it might need to be in other. And then overhead, as we discussed, is auto-calculated. So just think about all the different components of your budget and which of these categories they might fit in. And again, this information will also be available in more detailed format in the applicant handbook, which we'll get to soon. Katya, can you take this section?
Yes. So the reviewing the scoring criteria thoroughly. So some scoring criteria applies to certain grant types and not others. For example, planning versus implementation grants, implementation versus general ops. There's just some things within a planning grant that won't be scored in an implementation grant. There's some things in an implementation grant that won't be scored in a general operating grant. So just really looking through that scoring criteria thoroughly and making sure that you are understanding how your grant will be evaluated depending on what grant type it is. And I did mention this earlier, but I will mention it again because it's very important. The greenhouse gas reduction calculations, that is not something that applicants are expected to calculate on their own. Instead, PCEF staff, they apply a consistent formula across all applications using data provided in the supplemental forms. So you will be, if you are applying for especially a green infrastructure grant, you will be asked to provide that supplemental form where we'll ask a few questions about your project, and with that information, we will calculate in-house the greenhouse gas reduction score.
Great, thanks. Okay, this is a key portion of the rubric. as we are scoring, the project benefit scoring criteria has a list of GHG environmental benefits. And it's important to pay attention to this list. This says non-exhaustive. This should say that this is an exhaustive list. So we will fix that. But essentially, these listed benefits, we would expect to see either a direct relation or maybe a secondary tie to these specific activities as a result of your project, as we're trying to determine the GHG reduction efficiency or effectiveness of the project. Okay, key component of a RAGI application. Okay, we expect to see an identified site or communication of where you are in identifying a site as you apply. So we, as I mentioned before, don't give additional points to people that have secure or long-term land ownership versus folks that are leasing or renting land. But again, we do need to know where you are at in the site access process. If you are working with key partners or on partner sites, letters of support are helpful. And if the land access is dependent upon public land or an agency that owns public land, then letters of support would be required. So if you're working with a school district, if you're working with the city of Portland, maybe through Portland Parks and Recreation, the Bureau of Environmental Services, or the Portland Bureau of Transportation, maybe even a state agency like the Oregon Department of Transportation. And if you would not be able to complete the project without access to a site owned by one of those agencies, we will need a clear letter of support that identifies that you are allowed to be working on that land and that the project that you are applying for will be able to be completed with land access to that site. Another key component here is the maintenance plan. So Katya had mentioned that we really love to see a clear longevity of a project beyond just the life of the grant or the grant term. And so it's really important to include your plan to maintain the project long term. So how will community continue to access or benefit from the land improvements beyond the time that PCEF is funding the org or the project? How will the greenhouse gas reduction components of the project or the carbon sequestration practices be factored into the org's land stewardship approach post PCEF grant? And then also, how will key staff that are needed to maintain those practices on site be retained beyond the grant term? So those are things that we are kind of looking for within the narrative or the project proposal that you'll attach to your application in order to score the maintenance plan section of the scoring criteria. Okay, Katya, can you take this section?
Yes. So here are just some of our tips. These are ones that we created within our team, just based on things that we've seen over the past few grant cycles, things that we feel will be helpful. So the first thing is competitive RAGI applications demonstrate a strong awareness of the project's community benefit and highlight a strong, often pre-existing relationship with PCEF priority populations. So just keeping that in mind, that we really, as we mentioned in the previous slide, really would love to see a demonstration of understanding the community that this project is serving and an understanding of how that community will be able to use the site and use it beyond the time of this grant cycle. Keeping in mind that PCEF has many unique funding areas within the regenerative agriculture green infrastructure funding area, it's really important to clearly communicate the scale of the impact within your project. So for example, 10 trees in a forest will have a really different impact than 100 trees in a city environment. So just thinking about scale, and that's why we really encourage within milestones to be as specific as you can and quantify things as much as possible. Balancing the budgetary proportion of organizational operation and capacity staff time to community benefit. So really thinking, how many people do you realistically need on staff or contracted to serve the amount of people you want to serve? So that's something we'll definitely be looking at. Sometimes projects are really big and dreamy, and then we look at the staff and it just doesn't quite line up. So really just being realistic about what the capacity of your staff is and how much you're planning to hire through contracts so that you can meet those goals. Considering the ongoing stewardship of the site, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but just really thinking about the maintenance and the stewardship of the site once this grant ends is something we really want to see. Paying a special attention to grant types and funding caps. So this just reduces the follow-up during application review, as we mentioned. So just really paying attention to the requirements in general, but especially which type of grant you're applying for and what the funding cap is for that grant, since they are all a little bit different. So just double checking that. Building the PCEF's wage requirements and annual increases into your budget from the start. I think we've said it 3 times, and we really want to emphasize it and drive it home because it's really, really important. This is a really key element of the PCEF grant program. So just really making sure that you're looking at the wage requirements and making sure you're building that into your budget and accounting for those increases. And there is a strong RAGI ecosystem within the city of Portland, so please consider partnerships early with other organizations to strengthen components of your application. We really do love to see partner collaboration on a grant application. Since there is such limited funding, sometimes you can really submit a much stronger application if you're working together. So we really encourage any type of partnerships within the city that makes sense.
Great, thanks, Katya. Okay, now we're going to get into some resources for the 2026 community grants application cycle. Your primary resource, and we've been hinting at it, is going to be the 2026 applicant handbook. If you've found this technical assistance recording, it's likely that you've already passed or passed by on the website or reviewed the applicant handbook. But that is going to be your first place to go to for any questions about the application cycle. We'll also have open application office hours for you to ask questions in a group setting. We have the application portal. And so this is kind of a dashboard or an online interactive tool that shows all past eligible PCEF applications. So you can look at the application, you can see the milestones, the budget, the organization, you can see the funding area, if it was funded or not. So that's a really, really great resource that I would encourage you to check out. A key thing here, please do not email individual PCEF staff about application support or questions, regardless of if you have a current grant or have had a past grant. All application questions will be rerouted to the Clean Energy email inbox. And so if you have a question, we recommend just starting out by reaching out there. And that email is cleanenergyfund@portlandoregon.gov. It's listed here on the screen. You'll also find it on our website. So applicant handbook, again, your primary resource for application requirements and guidance. Please be sure to review this thoroughly before submitting your application. It's really great to review this with maybe your grant writing or your development team as you're thinking about what might be eligible, what wouldn't be eligible. It'll have key due dates and deadlines, also things to consider with types of payments that are allowed. This is a really, really great resource, and you can access this through our website. Katya, can you take this one about the portal?
Yes. So the Community Grants Program application portal, this is where you can see all eligible grant applications that were received. And this is really helpful because you can really look at the details of each of these projects, including the organization, the funding amount, the project type. And by exploring this database, you can really understand the prospective applicants. I'm sorry, you can really understand which applicants have already submitted and who has been awarded to get an understanding of what kind of projects we're looking for. And you can also take a look and see what other nonprofits are thinking of and proposing within the city of Portland. This could offer inspiration, but it can also maybe inspire some collaboration or some ideas of reaching out to some of these organizations to write an application together. So we really encourage folks to at least skim through this. It's incredibly useful.
Thanks, Katya. Okay, office hours. So during the open application period, PCEF staff will host office hours. These are group office hours, and they're open to anyone who has questions for staff and who is, just interested in listening to the questions of other people in a group setting. Again, you might hear about someone in the office hours who has a similar project idea as you. Maybe there are opportunities for collaboration. And at each of these office hours, we'll have at least one staff member from each funding area available. If there are questions that we receive there, we will add them to our frequently asked questions, which we'll go over in a little bit. And then if we can't answer the question or we need to follow up and get back to you, we will have you direct your question to the Clean Energy inbox and we'll follow up from there. So these are our upcoming applicant office hours. I'll go ahead and click here. And this is the registration page. So we'll host these through Microsoft Teams. Again, we'll have multiple options throughout the application period. If you have questions that you know you need answered early on, I'd really recommend coming early and as frequently as possible. We have office hours up until about a week or so before the application period closes, but those last 2 sessions usually get very, very full. And so I'd recommend, again, if you're able to come to some of the earlier sessions, even if you don't have clear questions yet, you might identify a question during the session. Someone might say something that might lead to a question you have. Just recommend getting support as early and as often as possible. Okay, and then FAQs. So another resource that we have is our frequently asked questions. So this is the City of Portland website, and this is the PCEF portion of the website. You'll find our frequently asked questions. And if you click here on regenerative agriculture and green infrastructure, it'll take you down to the frequently asked questions for our funding area. And so here, this is a really great starting point for some questions. And then again, as we have these office hours, as we receive questions throughout the application period through the Clean Energy inbox, we will be updating this in real time. If you are applying for other funding areas, you can also check out different frequently asked questions for those funding areas here. So again, just encourage you to explore the website, get really familiar with the applicant handbook, with the application portal, the frequently asked questions, attend office hours. We're here to support as best as we can. Yeah, thank you for watching this, for joining us. Again, if you have any questions, please direct them to that clean energy inbox. Yeah, good luck with the application process. Thank you.
Thank you.